Thank you, Jane, for your talk. Are there any questions? Yes.
What did the Buddha have to say about postmodernism?
What did the Buddha have to say about postmodernism? Hey, Buddha! That's a really funny question. Yeah.
What's the answer?
I just gave it. But, I'm trying to think, the Buddha actually doesn't say anything about aesthetics. Some forms of Buddhism develop, like both in China and Japan and Korea. The one in Japan is most famous. You have these tea ceremonies, and then you have like flower arranging, and you have the temple art, like the painting behind me over there. The painting behind me over there. I always get flipped because it's not a mirror image there. The painting behind me over there, that's an example of fairly high-class temple art. And yeah, but the Buddha never said anything. He didn't say depict me this way or that way. He didn't say anything about how music should be. He didn't say anything about that. There's a lot of things the Buddha never said anything about. He never, if you asked him what happens when I die, he'd say, beats me. That's not the point. There are a lot of things the Buddha didn't talk about. What the Buddha talked about was suffering and the end of suffering, just as in Jane's talk. That's what the Buddha talked about. And you can have any kind of music or dance or literature or art, anything you want. You can be the guy who makes, the thing on the radio, a guy who makes these little tiny sculptures out of gum wrappers. And they're very intricate. Unfortunately, they couldn't show them because it was on the radio. But yeah, this world is vast and wide, but the Buddha had real focus, suffering and the end of suffering. So that's very important. So we don't have to have opinions about postmodernism or rap music or, whatever, John Philip Sousa. Be kind to your web-footed friends. We don't have to do that. Just 100%. Just 100%. What is our job right now? That's the only real question. And, when Jane was talking about not wanting to have problems, you can recast problems as situations. There are some situations that cause suffering, and there are some situations that don't cause suffering. And the situation includes the person, so someone can be in a certain situation, they're not suffering, another person in the same situation, they're suffering. But you have all these, the world is vast and wide, and if you see everything as situations, then instead of trying to solve things, it's like, how can you help? That's a very different mindset. What is my function here? Like someone's cooking in the kitchen, and you go in and you see that there's a lot of stuff to do, and you say, how can I help? Which is not saying, how can I solve this problem of making dinner, but it's, how can I help? That's a very different attitude. So yeah, thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering about what Buddhism would say about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
What would Buddhism say about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So please remind us of the hierarchy of needs. And I'll repeat after you so people online can hear it.
I might get a couple of them confused,
Okay.
but like physical safety is 1 or 2.
So physical safety is very basic.
Yeah. And then above that, I think is socioeconomics, finances.
So financial security,
right.
Okay?
And then love and belonging.
And then love and belonging.
And then it's like the ego or your career, your sense of self.
Your sense of self, which is wrapped up in like your career.
Yeah.
That I find weird, but go on.
Yeah, I think so. And if anyone else has any other thing to add, and then enlightenment.
Maslow talked about enlightenment?
I think 5 is like spirituality, enlightenment.
Spirituality?
So the idea
They say that waking up is hard to do, yes?
So how, I guess my question is, if it's stuck, that, I guess I'm thinking this, I'm sure in a very Western way, but if someone's stuck at the earlier stage.
So is someone stuck at the earlier stages,
Their physical needs aren't met,
their physical needs aren't met,
or,
etc., then how do they touch the higher stages?
right, and
So don't make high and don't make low,
okay.
okay? So it is well known and is well documented that when you have a society that is truly in torment, in the middle of war, in the middle of earthquakes, in the middle of whatever the worst situation you can imagine, it is well documented that it is the people at the so-called bottom of the economic heap, the people who do not have physical security, never had it, never had financial security, they are the ones who will be the most helpful. Because the people who have that security around them all the time, they don't know how to function without it. Whereas people who don't have it, most of the time, they know how to function, they know how to love, they know how to feel joy, you know? They have to do it. So don't make a hierarchy. You know, these are tools. Anything like this, it's a tool. So it's like if you want to help somebody, if you're like a social worker or a psychoanalyst or a counselor or something, and someone comes to you and you want to check, or you go to the doctor, what's the first thing they say? Are you safe in your home? They always ask that. When you're old, they ask, have you fallen recently? They add that to it when you're old. But yeah, so do you have any thoughts of self-harm? So there's like a checklist that people have to check. Do you have a place to sleep at night? Do you have food insecurity? Because if somebody doesn't have those things, let's see how we can help them. But that's not to say that somebody who is unhoused or somebody who, lacks food, or somebody who doesn't have a job or whatever, or somebody who, for one reason or another, like people with certain facial deformities, they've never been looked at their whole life as like a regular person. That's not saying that they can't be at the so-called top either, Yeah, so these are useful checklists. But it's not like a rigid hierarchy where first this, then this, then this, then this. It's not like that at all. Yeah. Everyone has this true self. And everyone can touch this true self. And this true self is never born, it never dies. It cannot be described, it cannot be given a name, but every single being, not just human beings, every single being has this. So there's no hierarchy of needs, Just, is your true self shining and free? Is your true self shining forth? Or did you cover it up with mud and you can't touch it and you can't recognize it? And there's a lot of upheaval in the world right now. And a lot of people are expecting that in what has been a fairly safe place for many people, not all, not if your skin is a certain color, not if you come from certain countries, but basically white Americans can think, well, we've had it, we got all that mess. Well, we may be losing it. Many of us may be losing it. Can we respond? Can we respond with focus and grace and compassion to whatever happens around us? That's the question. So when your needs are not being met, that's when you find out who you really are. And I say this as someone who's been coddled all my life. I have no idea what I will be like if something really terrible happens. But I can hope that I can make that contact with this self that's always shining and free. And that what I do comes out of that self. And then I can be there for the beings around me without being wrapped up in self-pity and fear and anxiety. There's a wonderful photo of these women during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they're they're being marched to their death by these German soldiers, like guns literally like in their backs as they're walking. And they're singing. Don't let the bastards get you down, right? We all have that capacity. We all have that capacity not to shrivel up and shrink in terror. We all have that capacity. And I hope that very few of us need to use that capacity. I hope nobody has to use that capacity, but the fact is they do. But I hope that we find that capacity when it's needed, and that we have that capacity, in fact, all the time, and that's where our actions come from. So thank you for your question. Yeah, Buddhism is always cutting, well, Zen is always cutting through. Whenever you come, any classifications, Zen will cut through them. Like the Heart Sutra begins by cutting through the early Buddhist psychology, the Abhidharma, and psychology means psychology of perception. It means epistemology. It doesn't mean, did your mother hit you when you were 3 years old? It's an impersonal how we process this universe. And no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. There's the sense organs, and then it goes nothing to perceive, the things that are perceived, and then the mind that when I say, this is gray, it takes mind to do that. My eyes can respond to gray, but it's the brain that recognizes that this is gray, okay? So cuts through this very fundamental teaching about how we perceive this universe. So that's how Zen is. Zen is always cutting through. And when you come with a bunch of categories and a bunch of, a way to describe the world that's very nice and tight and explains everything, Zen will cut through that every time. Because that's what we do. Yeah?
The Heart Sutra scares me.
The Heart Sutra scares you. Good, tell me about it.
I'm afraid of not having eyes or ears.
You're afraid of not having eyes. Yeah. You're afraid of death.
Yeah.
You're afraid of not being. You're afraid of disappearing.
Yes.
Yeah. We're trained to do that. We're taught to do that. Yeah. Don't be afraid.
How?
You look at your fear. Yeah. So you look at your fear, right? I mean, I'm not going to tell you, oh, you don't have to be afraid because you'll die and you'll go to heaven and it'll be wonderful and God will reward you and you'll have the nicest harp and the prettiest. I'm not going to say that. I have no idea what happens when we die. But I do know that there's sort of two kinds of fear. There's functional fear, like I have a very bad sense of balance and I'm also afraid of heights. That's very useful. If you have a bad sense of balance, you should be afraid of heights, okay? But then there's the fear that I don't exist. We have this question, what am I? And we look at this question, what am I? And as you look at this question, you understand that the thing you think is you actually isn't there. It's made up. You are a conglomerate. Even physically, you're a conglomerate. You have all kinds of cells in your body that aren't your cells. They come from somewhere else. And they're very functional in your body, and you need them. You can't do without them. And you have, on a biological level, on a physiological level of brain science, there's all this stuff going on that is not what you think, how you think you make the universe. It's not who you think you are. There's all these studies being done now about children. This is actually not a side trip. Children learning mathematics and you think it has to make sense. In fact, no, they make the sense as they put it together. We make our idea of self as we put it together. We invent this idea of self and then we're terrified of losing it. And what you're talking about is a very human thing. We're trained to think of this this self that I must keep at all costs, right? And so we're terrified of losing it. And so there are two things. You can look at this, what am I? And you really look at the mechanism. The mechanism, you can't talk about it. It's so intimate. It's before speech, before thought, but you can look at it as you're sitting. You can see how these things arise that you attach to and call yourself. You can see those things. So you could, that's one thing. And the other thing is you can look at that anxiety. You can look at that fear. And you can see how really insubstantial it is. You know, I always like to say, anything like this, how much does it weigh? What color is it? Is it tall or short? Is it fat or thin? How much money does it have in the bank? You know, you ask these questions of your fear and your anxiety, you know, you look at it, what are you made out of? And it's not, it's an invention, it's a dream, you know? So we have these two techniques to really look at what am I, and to really look at this, you know, fear, anxiety. There are all kinds of so-called negative emotions. Even joy and happiness can get in the way of the universe. You know, you're so happy, and you say something and it really hurts somebody, but you don't even realize it because you're so happy, you know, right? So you just see these things arise. You see how insubstantial they are. You see how, you know, they're like a cloud, they're like a dream. You see all those things. And then you look at this, what am I? What am I? You look at it really hard. And then gradually this fear dissolves. You know, that's what the Heart Sutra is pointing at. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. So this fundamental emptiness of all phenomena. And it's emptiness that enables things to connect. That's why we can connect, because we're fundamentally empty. That doesn't mean we don't exist. It means that that there's a kind of fundamental thing that isn't a thing. Fundamentally, you can't name it. You can't confine it. And it intimately intertwines with everything. And then, what is the self to be worried about losing? You know? So, yeah. Very, very, very human. I remember when I first learned the Heart Sutra, I loved it. I had the opposite feeling of you. I felt it was such a relief. Such a relief, no eyes, no ears, no, you know, such a relief. And I was visiting my parents, they were living in San Diego at the time, and we were in Balboa Park. If you know Balboa Park, it's really pretty, and it has like cafes and things, and we're sitting outside this cafe, you know, their little patio, and sipping tea or whatever. And I start reciting the Heart Sutra to my parents, you know, and I go like, no eyes, no ears, no eyes. And my mother's going, so yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, it's not about ideas, it's direct perception. I can talk about Mahayana emptiness and interpenetration of all phenomena. I can do that, you know, forever. But the important thing is you observe it, you see it. You know, that's what's important. And then what words we use are not important. Yeah. What is it? All is well. All shall be well, all manner of things will be well. Julian of Norwich, you know, this nun in, 13th century or something, England. Yeah, anyway. It's not true, but it's cool. So, okay, that's enough. We're over time, so thank you, everybody.